World War III won't just be fought between nations, it'll be fought on supply chains, fuel reserves, and the reliability of local hospitals. It doesn't matter if your refuge has perfect landscapes, if antibiotics disappear, or the only power grid fails, beauty won't save you. The real question is, which countries already produce enough to survive without outside trade? Because in 2025, relying on global imports becomes a major vulnerability as disrupted supply lines set off, cascading economic and humanitarian failures. And that raises a more difficult point. Independence may matter more than neutrality itself. Why neutrality isn't enough anymore? Most people still believe that neutrality equals safety. The picture is familiar: quiet borders, steady governments, and a promise to stay out of the fight. But in today's world, that shield is already cracked. A country outside military blocks may avoid becoming a direct target, yet the moment supply lines falter, neutrality collapses into scarcity. Neutrality may keep missiles off your soil, it can't keep your grocery shelves stocked. Switzerland is often used as the textbook case. Its mountains and history give the impression of protection, but beneath that image is dependence. For fuel, food, and pharmaceuticals, Switzerland looks outward, and those lifelines are fragile. As researchers have noted, the post-Ukraine conflict period made clear that modern warfare stretches past the front lines into energy routes, grain shipments, and pharmaceutical exports. What matters now is less about territory under fire and more about whether tankers still sail and freight lines still move. Neutrality does nothing when those economic arteries are cut. That shift is not hypothetical. GA 2025 and multiple risk analyses point out that the true costs of systemic shocks are staggering, and supply chains have become as decisive as alliances. Where past conflicts allowed neutrals to trade through, today's global blocks and contested routes threaten to close doors on everyone, no matter their political stance. Neutrality once offered breathing space. Now it offers a false sense of calm that fractures as soon as the crises outside spill across borders. Take New Zealand. No one expects it to become a theater of battle in a world war, and more importantly, it is positioned with a massive agricultural surplus. Sheep, dairy, and crop production exceed domestic needs. It can sustain itself and even feed others if routes remain partially functional. This kind of food independence shows that survival today is tied not to how loudly a nation declares neutrality, but to what fills its silos and pastures. Compare that with a major economy like Japan, which heavily depends on food and energy imports. Neutral or not, if maritime trade closes, shortages become inevitable. The difference between resilience and fragility has little to do with political alignment. It lies in whether the farm fields and storage tanks within borders can cover the basics. Another example is Iceland. It is small, remote, yet energy-rich in a way few nations can match. Geothermal and hydroelectric systems provide nearly complete self-sufficiency in electricity and heat. In times of global disruption, Iceland has power while other countries scramble for oil or gas. That energy independence makes it more secure than many neutral countries tied to foreign supply. Again, neutrality as a declaration matters less than what can be produced at home when trade falters. This redefines survival in 2025. During earlier wars, countries could count on some flow of goods even under fire. Now resource choke points themselves have become intentional weapons. Cutting grain shipments has the same destabilizing effect as dropping bombs. Energy denial turns the lights out more effectively than planes in the sky. Healthcare collapses when vital drugs never arrive. Neutrality does not defend against these moves. Trade dependence makes nations brittle, regardless of how little interest they seem to hold to foreign powers. It is tempting to take comfort in the idea that if a nation is far from conflict zones, neutrality will protect its people. But geography cannot compensate for empty silos, powerless grids, or hospitals without medicine. The measure of survival is practical self-sufficiency. Can a country feed, power, and heal its population without outside help? If the answer is no, then neutrality is not a shield at all. It is a fragile statement waiting to be broken by disrupted logistics. This means neutrality today is less a strategy of peace and more a test of endurance. A government can avoid alliances, it can sign treaties, it can proclaim non-alignment, but none of that prevents famine or blackout once the imports stop. The line between resilience and collapse rests in how well a nation can function with doors closed. That is why the question of survival must be framed around independence, not declarations. Dependence is visible in trade balances, in farm production, in the raw numbers of what comes from outside and what is grown or generated within. And it is there that most neutral nations reveal their weakness. The point is stark but crucial. Neutrality belongs to the realm of politics. Survival belongs to the realm of logistics. A nation may avoid direct bombardment, but hunger crosses every border. In this age, when supply chains themselves are fragile and often weaponized, no amount of careful diplomacy can provide food when the world market halts. As conflicts widen, being left alone is not enough to endure. Neutrality might keep a nation clear of armies, but it cannot secure resilience in the face of worldwide scarcity. And as the world edges closer to conflict, the real question becomes less about whom countries side with and more about how they operate when the world closes in around them. Physical isolation once bought time, but today time vanishes quickly when grids fail or imports run dry. The next factor shaping survival is not found in treaties, but in geography itself, how distance still matters, but differently than it did in the past. The distance factor, isolation as protection. In the past, being far from conflict zones offered real protection. Entire regions avoided the destruction of major wars simply because armies could not reach them. During the Second World War, nations on distant shores lived with fewer disruptions, shielded by the difficulty of transporting heavy equipment and supplies across oceans. Survival often came down to geography. Being hard to reach meant being spared. But that advantage has weakened. Long-range and advanced strike capabilities, including hypersonic and cruise missiles, compress distance in ways previous generations never imagined. Unmanned drones coordinated through satellites bring precision attacks to places that once might have felt untouchable. It is no longer necessary to send fleets across the sea to reach remote targets. Modern systems give military powers technical reach into the world's farthest corners, eroding geography's old protective buffer. The challenge is no longer just physical strike systems. Cyber warfare makes physical remoteness irrelevant. Energy grids, financial systems, and communications networks are now accessible to attackers thousands of miles away. A small, isolated island can still be disrupted in seconds if its infrastructure depends on undersea internet cables or satellite connections. With these tools, the protective margin that once came from being distant has nearly collapsed. Yet technological reach does not mean every remote place is suddenly doomed. Launching advanced weapons or committing cyber resources is not random. Powers prioritize targets that alter the balance of a war, not places that merely exist far from battle. This is where the logic of strategic insignificance replaces pure distance. A nation or settlement gains safety when it lacks assets worth striking, when it has no bases, no choke points, no minerals vital to weapons production, and no industries critical to opposing powers. In short, weapons extend reach, but strategic value still decides whether strikes are ordered. Fiji offers a research-backed illustration. Despite being a set of islands in the South Pacific, it hosts no large military bases, controls no critical global shipping lanes, and fields only about 4,000 active personnel with a larger but lightly equipped reserve. Its economic strengths lie in agriculture and fisheries, not resources tied to advanced weapons supply. In strategic terms, it is low priority. Even with today's strike technologies, it would likely remain far down on targeting lists. Tuvalu is another example. Though smaller and more resource-limited, its absence of military or industrial value gives it the same kind of invisibility. Contrast that with locations that may be remote but still relevant. Greenland, for example, has a sparse population but geographic proximity to the North Atlantic and the Arctic regions that military planners already consider important for navigation and submarine routes. Remoteness matters little here because positioning and resources increase strategic significance. This is the key tension. Isolation only shelters populations when irrelevance coincides with distance. The Pacific Islands further demonstrate how relevance can shift rapidly. For decades, places like Fiji or Tuvalu functioned as peripheral territories. But as regional rivalries intensify, concepts like the first island chain in East Asia are reminders that archipelagos can form natural strategic lines. If those outer defensive lines broke down, more distant island groups could gain new importance as fallback points. Even islands that now look insignificant could move up priority lists in a widening conflict. That uncertainty adds to the risks of treating distance as permanent shelter. Still, for many islands without bases or key resources, insignificance combined with isolation remains the closest thing to protection. Technology enables precision strikes, but strategy decides they are unnecessary. For war planners balancing costs, logistics, and political optics, a coconut grove on Tuvalu matters far less than a naval station in Guam. Irrelevance creates invisibility, and invisibility still provides safety margins, albeit in fragile form. This also explains why not all remote regions are treated equally. Natural resources can erase insignificance, no matter a location's distance. An isolated country rich in oil or rare earth minerals quickly becomes strategic, drawing attention rather than avoiding it. In these cases, isolation is not enough. The very assets that might sustain a population become liabilities that attract external interest during conflict. On the other hand, regions with both distance and resource independence, but limited military or geopolitical value, still hold some of the best prospects for survival. They are unlikely to merit advanced munitions or sustained blockades, and may be bypassed entirely as larger actors focus on decisive objectives. Their challenge is not bombardment, but sustainability. Remote communities cannot rely on help during war. Survival depends on whether they already produce the food, water, and energy to remain stable in isolation. That difference creates an ironic trade. The very remoteness and powerlessness that make certain islands unattractive to adversaries also leave them cut off from aid. Nations like Fiji, with fertile land and abundant fisheries, at least have foundations for long-term resilience. Tuvalu, though safer from targeting, faces greater challenges because its limited resources reduce prospects for long-term survival when cut off. Isolation becomes protective only if it is matched by self-sufficiency. This principle alters how safe havens should be judged. The question is no longer, how far away is this place from potential frontlines? It is, how little does this place matter to anyone else? When measured in these terms, the safest places are rarely cities with airports or trade hubs. They are the overlooked corners that attract no notice because they have no decisive assets. Their survival depends on producing enough for themselves and being too unimportant to change the course of war. Perception adds another complicating factor. Some small countries have invited foreign basing rights or built logistics hubs, trading insignificance for economic benefit. But those choices reshape their security outlook. A port once leased to a great power can transform a previously irrelevant island into a strike target. Remoteness cannot undo that shift, and weapons systems ensure targeting can be carried out efficiently when necessary. Where governments resist this role and remain irrelevant, survival chances remain stronger. Symbolism matters as well. Strikes are not always about military function alone. They often target places that carry psychological or political weight. Capitals, bases, and infrastructure with global recognition rise on attack lists even if they are far from the main battle spaces. A forgotten rural setting or nameless settlement offers no such advantage. Leaders expending resources prefer to demonstrate power on targets the world notices. In contrast, insignificance denies publicity value, as much a shield as geography once was. Conclusion is straightforward. Distance still offers a degree of buffer, but no longer guarantees protection. Advanced strike systems have neutralized geography's old guarantees. Cyber networks erase gaps between continents. What remains as protection is invisibility through irrelevance, paired with internal sustainability. Remote communities must already be able to supply themselves with agriculture, water, and power. Without those foundations, remoteness simply becomes abandonment in a crisis. So while distance is no longer a shield on its own, it can still combine with insignificance and resource self-reliance to create the closest approximation of safety. The lesson is that today's survival map is not judged by miles, but by whether a location matters to larger powers and whether it can stand on its own once global systems fracture. This recognition naturally shifts our focus to the opposite side of the equation. If some regions survive by vanishing from strategic calculations, others stand at the center of them. Understanding which areas will carry the heaviest burdens of conflict is essential for anyone assessing where not to be. The next layer of analysis shows where the most likely hot zones emerge and why those living close to them face the greatest danger. The critical map, expected WWAI hot zones. When looking at the map in 2025, certain regions stand out not just as sites of tension, but as places where escalation could ignite global war. These are not speculative guesses, they are the corridors already identified by strategists and reinforced by years of military buildup. The Taiwan Strait, Eastern Europe, and the Gulf remain the three most critical zones, each representing a point where great power confrontation and alliance commitments converge. The Taiwan Strait has long been treated as a pressure point, but it has taken on new urgency. The distance across is barely 100 miles, and each side views control of the strait as existential. On one shore, Beijing continues its rapid military modernization, expanding naval fleets, deploying sophisticated missile systems, and running large-scale exercises that demonstrate not only blockade potential, but also long-range strike capacity throughout the first and second island chains. On the other shore, Taipei relies on US and allied guarantees, which tie Japan, South Korea, Australia, and bases as far away as Guam into the conflict path. The danger here is not limited to the island itself. It extends across the Pacific Arc, where both the United States and China prepare to project force. For civilians inside this geography, strategic realities make evacuation nearly impossible once hostilities begin. Shifting to Europe, the second hotspot is not hypothetical, it is already burning. Fighting in Ukraine continues into a third year, with neither Moscow nor Kiev signaling willingness to settle. Russia has committed record resources, spending nearly one-fifth of its federal budget on the conflict in 2024, while casualty estimates soar. The war's intensity remains high, with data from ACLED showing the sharpest rise in recorded battles over the past year. NATO's eastern members, Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, are now at the edge of the fault line. At the same time, European military expenditure is climbing at the fastest pace since the Cold War, with SIPRI tracking steep increases across frontline states. In practical terms, this places millions of civilians in direct proximity to fortified defenses, forward troop deployments, missile batteries, and cyber warfare hubs. For them, living anywhere along the eastern flank of Europe means absorbing the first effects of escalation far beyond Ukraine itself. The third critical zone lies in the Gulf, where geography and global dependence combine into one of the most volatile flashpoints. The Strait of Hormuz remains among the most strategic corridors on Earth, funneling close to one-fifth of global oil exports through a narrow channel. Iran maintains the means and the intent to disrupt shipping, while Gulf states and US naval assets sit opposite, ready to respond. Recent years have seen not only clashes in Gaza and southern Lebanon, but also expanded proxy mobilization between Iran and Israeli-aligned states, heightening the risk of multi-front escalation. Analysts consistently rank the Gulf as a systemic choke point. Closing it, or even partially blockading, it does more than interrupt supplies. It triggers immediate energy shocks across the global economy. Civilians living from Kuwait City to Muscat are surrounded by bases, pipelines, export terminals, and military deployments that will be among the first to face strikes in a wider war. Food insecurity compounds this structural risk, since heavy dependence on imported staples makes Gulf populations acutely vulnerable the moment maritime trade falters. These three hotspots matter not only for who lives inside them, but for the way alliances link them together. Modern treaties and power blocks turn local escalations into multinational confrontations. Analysts at the DIA and S&P Global describe this as chain reaction risk, when one spark rapidly activates overlapping alliances and commitments across several theaters. For ordinary citizens, this risk translates into a single reality. Countries that host logistics hubs, refueling stations, or bases become potential strike zones, even if they are not geographically close to main battlefronts. Keflavik in Iceland or Lajes Field in the Azores, for example, are far from land wars, but serve critical transit and support functions for Western militaries, making them visible on the target lists of adversaries. Geography alone does not erase exposure. A base on your territory ensures your map square is inside the war game. This is why wealth, infrastructure, or development offer no shield in the Gulf or elsewhere. Resource dependence and alliance infrastructure override the perception of safety. Gulf states, despite their financial capacity, remain tied to import-heavy food systems and sit at the heart of global energy routes. Their pipelines and export terminals transform stability into fragility during war, because adversaries know that striking them reshapes global flows overnight. For civilians in Abu Dhabi or Doha, this means skyscrapers and financial centers are embedded inside contested supply networks. In a wider conflict, those networks become deliberate targets of disruption. For Europe, the same principle applies. Poland, positioned on NATO's front line, is both shielded by its allies and endangered by its strategic role. The entire country functions as a staging area, which erases any hope of keeping urban centers safely removed from strike planning. Even nations deeper inside the continent, Germany, the Netherlands, or Italy, host bases, logistics, and command nodes central to NATO operations. In a full-scale war, their infrastructure is entangled in escalation, drawing fire regardless of geography, from refueling depots in Ramstein to logistics corridors along major highways. Daily life overlaps with military targets. Civilians are not hit for who they are, but for what their neighborhoods contain. Asia shows the same pattern. South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines are embedded directly within US treaty obligations. Hosting bases ensures their territory doubles as operational space for Western projection into East Asia. Even islands with no domestic intent to engage find themselves defined by the assets they allow onto their soil. A similar calculus applies to distant outposts such as Guam or Diego Garcia, territory catalogued on adversary targeting maps before any official declarations. Civilians inhabiting those areas inherit those risks by default, regardless of their government's rhetoric. Taken together, the Taiwan Strait, Eastern Europe, and the Gulf represent more than battle lines. They define entire zones of systemic weakness for populations inside them. Energy choke points, treaty obligations, and military staging areas transform whole regions into flashpoints layered with overlapping risks. For ordinary people, the first and most important lesson of the critical map is to step away from these corridors. Living within them means absorbing the direct consequences of escalation, whether through missiles, energy cutoff, transport interruption, or cyber sabotage. It is not enough to avoid frontlines. One must avoid being even in the supply chains that sustain them. But mapping exposure is only the beginning. These three corridors represent the routes where escalation ripples outward fastest, yet the dangers of global war do not stop at the limits of the combat zone. Even nations that remain distant from any alliance or hotspot face risks their populations rarely consider. When weapons of mass destruction enter the equation, devastation is not limited to blast zones or immediate battlefronts. Invisible currents carry hazards across continents, moving destruction along atmospheric routes no map of alliances can fully predict. It is here that another layer of risk emerges, one that complicates survival planning far beyond the boundaries of these visible hotspots. Nuclear fallout patterns most people ignore. When nuclear war is imagined, most people focus on the obvious: cities flattened in seconds, firestorms tearing through neighborhoods, and mushroom clouds towering over the horizon. But in truth, most lives at risk are threatened not by the explosion itself, but by the invisible danger that spreads afterward, radioactive fallout carried by the wind. Unlike missiles, fallout doesn't stop at frontiers. It rides atmospheric currents across entire regions, contaminating ground, water, food, and air far from the original detonation site. People who assume they are safe simply because they don't live near a military base, a major city, or a primary target overlook the global reach of fallout patterns. A nuclear blast forces sand, soil, and debris skyward, mixing it with radioactive fission products. The higher and denser this cloud rises, the farther those radioactive particles can travel. Where they land depends on factors such as wind speed, jet stream position, and even whether the detonation occurred at the surface or in the air. Surface blasts create vastly more fallout, sucking local material into the atmosphere and irradiating it, while airbursts generate less ground contamination. Still, in both cases, fallout footprints reflect weather, not political borders. Someone thousands of miles from the detonation may still absorb dangerous doses if they happen to be downwind on the wrong day. Most nuclear-armed states and major population centers sit in the northern hemisphere. Combine that with the fact that the strongest jet streams flow west to east across these latitudes, and the result is a zone where fallout exposure risks are far higher. This means nuclear strikes in Europe, North America, or East Asia don't remain local. They seed radiation across other nations sharing those skies. A detonation in Eastern Europe could contaminate farmland in Scandinavia. Explosions in Korea could carry fallout toward Japan or sweep debris across the Pacific toward North America. The impact doesn't radiate outward in neat circles the way people often imagine. Instead, it stretches in narrow plumes, sometimes extending hundreds of miles. Models used in emergency response, such as those cited by U.S. health agencies, describe fallout in zones, severe, moderate, and light contamination areas spreading downwind. Within those paths lies what officials call the dangerous fallout zone, an elongated footprint where exposure becomes life-threatening. The precise shape and reach of that zone vary with weather and the altitude at which debris was injected into the air. This unpredictability is why fallout is so often underestimated. Two towns at the same distance from a blast can experience opposite outcomes, one relatively safe while the other suffers extreme radiation levels. Countries that identify as neutral are not immune to these patterns. Geography offers no shield when fallout travels on wind. Scandinavia often illustrates this dilemma. Sweden and Norway may avoid direct strikes, yet they lie downwind from Central Europe and Western Russia, regions expected to see heavy conflict. If nuclear detonations occur in Poland, Germany, or Russia, contamination could cross into Scandinavian rivers, soils, and pastures within days. Neutrality helps avoid bombs, but it cannot redirect atmospheric flows. Canada shows another paradox. With its vast landmass and sparse population, it might appear to be a natural refuge, yet much of Canada lies directly north of U.S. population centers, military bases, and naval infrastructure. In the event of nuclear strikes across the United States, prevailing winds push northward as well as eastward. That means fallout reaching into Canadian provinces even without a single weapon detonating on Canadian soil. A society untouched by bombing could still suffer from irradiated farmland and poisoned water supplies because it sits next to a primary battleground. The same logic applies elsewhere. Central Asia seems remote, but fallout traveling from European Russia or the Middle East can stretch across Kazakhstan and Mongolia depending on jet stream activity. Northern China, often overlooked on battle maps, remains tightly linked to potential contamination through atmospheric circulation. Populations there may not face instant destruction, but could endure slow declines in health, food security, and water quality as radioactive dust settles across cropland. By contrast, the Southern Hemisphere holds a unique comparative advantage. Global air circulation patterns are less interconnected across the equator. The equatorial boundary slows the movement of radioactive plumes between hemispheres, meaning fallout from northern conflicts struggles to drift south in high concentrations. Analysts note that countries like New Zealand, Uruguay, Argentina, and southern regions of Chile would likely face far lower fallout intensity, even in the case of a massive northern hemisphere exchange. This difference does not mean immunity, but it does mean reduced long-term contamination of farmland and rivers in most southern hemisphere geographies. New Zealand often comes up as a prime example. Positioned thousands of miles from major northern strike zones, its southern latitude places it outside the main jet stream corridors carrying fallout eastward and across the northern continents. While radiation may still eventually circle the globe in diluted form, the intensity reaching New Zealand's farmland would likely be far lower compared to that landing across Europe or North America. It's a geographic edge rooted in physics rather than politics, offering relative protection when much of the Earth's arable land is at risk. South America as a whole faces similar dynamics. Nations such as Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay remain south of the equator, with largely self-contained weather systems. Fallout from large-scale northern exchanges would dissipate before crossing into tropical and subtropical zones in dangerous concentrations. The primary challenges for people in these nations would not be high-dose radiation exposure, but supply disruptions, trade collapse, and the indirect effects of global economic breakdown. In relative terms, their agricultural systems, if preserved, could sustain populations better than northern regions where soil and water basins would face radioactive contamination. Still, relying purely on atmospheric shelter ignores another long-term risk: nuclear winter. When nuclear detonations ignite widespread firestorms, soot and debris can climb into the stratosphere. At that altitude, particles can circulate the globe, blocking sunlight and lowering temperatures. Princeton's well-known models of limited exchanges illustrate how quickly local attacks could escalate into scenarios that dim skies across both hemispheres. While this kind of cooling looks different from fallout, it doesn't irradiate soil directly. It compromises agriculture everywhere. Crops fail in both north and south, and food production collapses at a global scale. Fallout defines toxic zones. Nuclear winter redefines global climate. Both matter for survival in different ways. Survival, then, depends on more than avoiding the fallout plume. Even inside the northern hemisphere, safer microregions exist. Local wind conditions, elevation, rainfall, and the timing of detonation shape fallout intensity in complex ways. It is possible for a community farther from a target to be less safe than one closer, simply because the wind carried radiation in its direction. Rain also plays a role. Precipitation can pull radioactive particles from the air more quickly, creating hot spots far from ground zero. This uneven spread ensures that no map of safe and unsafe zones is ever perfectly accurate. Planning for resilience requires acknowledging that some areas will be unpredictably worse than others, regardless of how distant they look on a globe. Underground shelters or hardened bunkers often enter these discussions. They provide crucial protection during the first days when radiation levels are highest, and health guidelines stress that radiation intensity can fall dramatically after 3 days, sometimes dropping by factors of 100 in that time frame. This makes sheltering in place a short-term survival priority. Yet the larger issue remains unsolved: long-term exposure to contaminated farmland and water. Communities cannot remain sealed underground indefinitely. To rebuild and sustain societies, access to clean soil, renewable water, and uncontaminated food production is still required. That is why entire Southern Hemisphere nations, distanced from fallout-heavy skies, may hold more enduring advantages than any shelter built in the middle of Northern Hemisphere target zones. Ultimately, the key lesson about fallout is that it transforms war from something fought at specific coordinates into something fought through the atmosphere itself. The true danger is not only being bombed, but being positioned downwind of where the bombs fall. Countries considered safe for their neutrality or distance from conflict maps may prove deeply vulnerable once atmospheric circulation is factored in. And the inverse is also true. Some overlooked regions may prove safer not because of politics or wealth, but because wind and latitude reduce their exposure. Fallout patterns show that survival is not only a question of geography on the ground, it is a question of position in the air above. And once the skies are poisoned or darkened, the battle shifts again. The central issue becomes whether a nation can continue to feed and power itself under disrupted conditions. Food and energy autonomy, the real survival metric. Scarcity is no longer just an economic inconvenience, It is a deliberate weapon. In large-scale conflict, ships and aircraft are not only targets in themselves, but conduits of survival. Blockaded ports, embargoed fuel tankers, and interrupted food shipments could unravel a society just as completely as direct strikes. A country may avoid the battlefield and still collapse weeks later if power no longer runs through its grid, if supermarket shelves are stripped bare, or if its vehicles sit idle with no oil to drive supply routes. In 2025, the ability to withstand these breakages is defined by one measure above all: food and energy autonomy. Global research on disaster impacts highlights how fragile systems compound risk. GAR 2025 notes that disruptions in key supplies can trigger macroeconomic spirals, making entire societies more vulnerable than their GDP figures suggest. Wealth alone offers no shield if lifelines depend on trade. Investments in resilience, strengthening domestic food production and sustainable energy, determine whether supply shocks topple a country's economy or allow it to keep functioning. For highly developed but import-reliant nations, this dependency is the silent threat. Japan is one example frequently discussed, a global leader in technology and industry, yet heavily dependent on external food supplies. In years of stability, this dependence disappears into the background of a seamless global market. But in wartime, shipping lanes are choke points, and Pacific trade routes are among the most heavily surveilled and contested on the planet. A prolonged disruption that could empty shelves not through strikes on cities, but by halting the daily flow of shipments required to feed tens of millions. In contrast, countries with agricultural surpluses and renewable power already embedded in their systems gain an edge. South America shows this clearly. Argentina and Brazil have long fed the world through maize, soy, beef, and wheat exports. Were international markets to close, both nations would still command the capacity to feed their populations many times over. For large nations with internal variation in climate and soil, domestic abundance cushions the blow of losing imports. Paraguay further illustrates the importance of pairing surplus food with surplus energy. The Itaipu Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric projects on Earth, generates far more than local households and industries consume. In peacetime, electricity flows across borders into Brazil and Argentina. In wartime, those exports could be rerouted inward, creating continuity of supply for its citizens. Energy security in this form doesn't depend on vulnerable shipping routes or imported fuel. It is produced and consumed within the same border. Iceland demonstrates this resilience in an entirely different setting. With a small population and national grid powered almost entirely by geothermal and hydropower, energy scarcity is not an imminent threat. Even if consumer imports were cut, light, heating, and industrial power would remain intact. Few other countries can maintain modern standards of living under complete isolation. Iceland comes closer to that benchmark than most. Its limitation is in food, as fishing provides much but arable land is restricted. Still, the principle is clear. A grid fully run on renewable domestic resources frees a nation from the vulnerabilities of oil embargoes and fuel blockades. New Zealand's profile may combine the best of both worlds. Agriculture generates a surplus of dairy, meat, and fruit far beyond domestic need, while renewable energy contributes the bulk of electricity nationwide. Its geographic isolation makes imports slower and more challenging under normal circumstances, so its systems already prioritize internal sustainability. This reliance on domestic production, combined with distance from frontline powers, creates a rare kind of resilience. Scarcity as a weapon falters when a country wields strong domestic food supply and renewable infrastructure. Smaller players matter too. Uruguay has leveraged wind and hydropower to generate much of its electricity, while also maintaining robust agricultural exports. Chile, drawing from hydroelectric and solar growth, combines a secure energy portfolio with significant agricultural lands. Each of these cases illustrates how food and renewable reserves act as shields in ways military might and wealth cannot replicate. Even where nations are still dependent on fossil fuels, the global energy transition has influenced resilience in meaningful ways. The 2025 Energy Transition Index shows modest but measurable progress toward decentralization and modernization of grids, efforts designed not only for environmental goals, but to add security against volatility. Brazil's expansion of its national transmission backbone, for instance, ensures power from sun-drenched northeast regions flows south to industry, making the overall grid more balanced and less likely to collapse in isolation. India's hydrogen initiatives likewise aim to diversify states into energy self-production, a recognition that import dependence is dangerous in a fragile global climate. These projects sketch a long-term hedge against scarcity becoming a weapon. Underlying all of this is the dual requirement for survival: food plus power. Neither alone suffices. Argentina, Brazil, and New Zealand appear stronger because they generate both in meaningful quantity. Other nations may specialize in one dimension, but weakness in the other ensures imbalance. Fertile soil without steady electricity cripples harvests through broken irrigation and machinery. Renewable grids without homegrown food merely power a hungry population. The survival metric works only when both arms of life, calories and kilowatts, are retained within borders. Governments understand these risks unevenly. In regions like the Gulf, immense wealth funds advanced infrastructure, yet basic calories are still imported. Their petroleum wealth cannot conjure wheat in the absence of steady trade. When shipping halts across Hormuz or the Red Sea, scarcity strikes populations whose markets rest on foreign food. In other cases, wealthy European states rely too comfortably on global trade, their fields and fisheries no longer sufficient to sustain tens of millions in isolation. The vulnerability lies less in their defenses than in the assumption that imports would always be available. The distinction is stark. No nation is perfectly independent, but some can endure without imports far longer than others. Losing access to cars or electronics is inconvenient. Losing access to calories or energy is collapse. In that sense, nations invisible on maps of military power may be far more durable than superpowers because their resilience does not depend on open seas or cooperative neighbors. As scarcity increasingly operates as a deliberate weapon in projected conflicts, autonomy in food and energy takes on the character of a survival threshold. Countries that can feed their populations and keep their grids powered under isolation are positioned to endure. Those that cannot will falter quickly. This difference explains why resilience planning now matters as much as alliances or borders. It redefines which nations are fragile and which hold quiet strength when systems break down. Yet resilience is not measured by crops and kilowatts alone. Scarcity attacks more than food and energy. Once shortages destabilize society, attention shifts to a different layer of survival, whether communities retain functioning hospitals, medication supplies, and stable infrastructure under siege. And here, hidden vulnerabilities appear that are easy to overlook until it is too late. Healthcare and infrastructure under siege. In a global conflict, survival is often imagined in terms of food stores or fortified shelters, but the real test comes when healthcare and national infrastructure are placed under maximum strain. Hospitals, clinics, and the systems that support them are lifelines during peace, yet in war they quickly turn into fragile choke points. A society can endure supply shortages for a time, but if its hospitals lose power, if antibiotics run out, or if clean water is no longer accessible, the collapse of public health outpaces the damage of bombs. GA 2025 points out that disasters often kill more people through secondary effects, disease, service collapse, and infrastructure breakdown than through direct violence. That sobering reality applies even more in the chaos of war. Modern healthcare relies on three dependencies that are often invisible until they fail: energy, clean water, and logistics tied to both supply chains and digital coordination. Each one can carry a society through crisis when stable, or drag it into collapse when disrupted. Energy is the most obvious. Every hospital requires uninterrupted power to keep ventilators running, surgical equipment functional, and life-saving drugs cold in storage. In peacetime, backup generators can bridge short outages, but in war, fuel imports dry up, and repairs to central grids slow to a crawl. Countries already grappling with weak infrastructure reveal how fragile these systems are. South Africa provides a telling insight. By 2023, rolling blackouts reached up to 12 hours in some areas, leaving hospitals and clinics unable to maintain consistent service. If outages of that magnitude already happen without conflict, the added strain of disrupted imports or sabotage in a world war would cut systems deeper still. By contrast, Iceland demonstrates a very different profile. Running almost entirely on domestic hydro and geothermal energy, with over 90% of homes heated geothermally, its essential medical infrastructure could continue operating with less dependence on foreign inputs. Even in wartime, its hospitals are far more likely to keep the lights on. Water ranks just as high in importance. Without it, sanitation systems collapse, operating rooms become unsafe, and everyday treatment of wounds or burns can turn deadly. The World Health Organization, through its Joint Monitoring Program, has tracked global struggles in providing safe water and sanitation since the 1990s, emphasizing that access is fundamental to reducing childhood deaths and disease outbreaks. In wartime, those pipelines and purification systems become almost impossible to repair quickly once damaged. Contaminated water brings cholera, typhoid, and countless foodborne illnesses back into crowded communities, overwhelming already fragile care facilities. A society's hospital capacity can be rendered useless in days simply because water pressure is gone or reservoirs are polluted. The third dependency, logistics and digital coordination, has become more critical and more vulnerable at the same time. Modern medical systems depend on global supply chains for drugs, equipment, and replacement parts, and they rely heavily on integrated digital records and communications to function efficiently. That interconnectedness creates exposure. Cyberattacks against healthcare or energy networks, already identified among the top geopolitical risks of 2025, can paralyze systems instantly. A keystroke by an attacker can corrupt databases, lock out records, or disable logistics software needed for shipments. In a world where everything from MRI machines to dialysis units requires calibrated network-linked systems, a cyber assault can be as crippling as a missile strike. All three of these dependencies, power, water, and logistics, feed directly into how quickly healthcare collapses under stress. Even wealthy nations with strong budgets cannot instantly manufacture antibiotics or restore grids when maritime trade halts. Analysis across risk reports shows that domestic healthcare resilience, not economic strength, determines survival during long disruptions. A technologically advanced system can strain faster than expected if it imports nearly all its critical drugs or faces shortages of technical specialists who cannot be replaced in wartime. Population size compounds these stresses. A nation of hundreds of millions inevitably faces more demand than it can satisfy when inputs collapse. Seasonal surges already stretch otherwise advanced systems like those of the United States, where shortages of staff and medication often appear before wars even enter the picture. Superimpose global supply chain interruptions, cyber strikes on power, and mass casualties from conflict, and the cracks become chasms. By contrast, countries with smaller populations and equitable healthcare systems scale their services more sustainably under stress. Iceland again, or some of the Nordic states with robust renewable energy and strong public systems, are better positioned simply because fewer people compete for finite supplies in an emergency. Healthcare resilience is also a question of governance structure. Systems that prioritize universal access spread what resources exist more evenly. Countries without those frameworks often slide into unchecked inequality during crisis, with elites hoarding treatments while poorer communities are left without. GA 2025 highlights that when resilience mechanisms fail, shocks turn quickly into instability as service collapse fuels unrest. Systems that already embed procedures for equitable resource distribution can keep order longer, even when shortages bite hard. Taken together, healthcare's fragility underlines why survival cannot be judged by frontline risk alone. A small, neutral country with energy independence and clean water management could protect its people from collapse better than a military power tethered to imports. A single facility's ability to keep ventilators running or water filters operating may decide the long-term viability of a society. No nation escapes the need for these pillars. Missiles may dictate when war begins, but the durability of hospitals and infrastructure decides how many civilians endure its length. That reality leads naturally to examining specific cases. Some countries embody the strengths and weaknesses outlined here, nations where food surpluses and energy resilience look secure, but where other commitments or vulnerabilities complicate survival. These examples show the difference between theoretical safety and lived resilience in a global war scenario. Case study: New Zealand's double edge. New Zealand stands out as a country that often appears near the top of survival lists when people consider the realities of a global war. Its location in the southern Pacific places it far from the most likely theaters of conflict, and its scale of resources relative to population gives it resilience few others can match. With only around 5 million people supported by fertile farmland, abundant fisheries, and reliable renewable energy, it is positioned differently than larger nations that rely entirely on trade flows. In 2025, its defense budget sits at about $3.03 billion, ranking 61st worldwide, and its armed forces total roughly 15,000 personnel. That modest profile underscores its limited role militarily, but it also keeps it largely below the radar in global strategy. The first pillar of New Zealand's strength is its food security. In a world where disruption of imports and blockades dominate, the country stands out for its surplus. With 25.3 million sheep, 5 for every resident, plus thriving cattle, dairy, and grain production, it produces far more than it consumes. Crops such as wheat, oats, barley, and legumes offer dietary resilience, while surrounding waters add fisheries rich in kingfish, snapper, tuna, and salmon. Where many developed countries would face immediate rationing once trade halts, New Zealand would shift to inward supply without risking basic sustenance. Its true challenge lies not in finding food to eat, but in managing the economic impact of disappearing exports. Energy independence reinforces this security. The bulk of New Zealand's power grid relies on renewable sources like hydropower and geothermal output, strong enough to maintain electricity to households, hospitals, and agriculture, even if oil markets shatter and shipping halts. Transport and aviation would still feel acute pressure because liquid fuel imports remain essential, but the national grid would not collapse. Comparing this to Iceland strengthens the point. Its electricity is supplied almost entirely through renewables, about 70% from hydro and 30% from geothermal. These models show how nations drawing primarily on local resources preserve their lifelines longer during a global supply breakdown. Energy autonomy gives New Zealand capacity to remain functional in ways heavily import-dependent societies cannot. Still, insulation is never complete. New Zealand is closely aligned with the United States and remains part of Western defense frameworks. While it does not host large foreign bases in peacetime, in the context of global war, its political associations could invite diplomatic pressure. The risk is not automatic targeting, but the possibility of being asked to provide logistical support, facilities, or cooperation. Those decisions could alter outside perceptions, transforming it from strategically irrelevant to modestly relevant in the calculus of rivals. In practice, it is those alliance dynamics, not geography, that hold the greatest uncertainty. Distance, however, remains decisive when evaluating actual likelihood of attack. Projection of military power across the Pacific requires extraordinary logistics. China, frequently mentioned as a potential long-range challenger, has little recent experience sustaining operations anywhere near New Zealand's vicinity. Its energy would overwhelmingly focus on nearer priorities, the Taiwan Strait, Japan, or US outposts like Guam. Russia likewise has no meaningful forward presence in the South Pacific. Missiles theoretically could reach long ranges, but building and coordinating the networks for lasting strikes at such distances is far more difficult than raw range numbers imply. Practically, the US mainland and forward bases are more obvious targets than a distant island nation with limited strategic weight. Resource endowment plays a smaller but noteworthy role. New Zealand has reserves of coal, oil, natural gas, gold, silver, and iron ore. None match the global scale of producers like Australia, Russia, or Brazil, but assets of this kind can still shape international bargaining. In a post-war order, victorious powers could pressure US allies for concessions or tribute. In New Zealand's case, this would occur through economics rather than military seizure. Extraction requires infrastructure and stability, both of which would likely be constrained under global breakdown. It is less a question of physical invasion and more about leverage applied in diplomacy. A frequent point of discussion is its very small armed forces. 15,000 personnel may guard borders and maintain sovereignty in peacetime, but they cannot resist a major invasion or project force abroad. This paradox matters. Small size makes New Zealand irrelevant to high-stakes war planning, yet defensively vulnerable if suddenly designated as territory worth taking. Probability still leans heavily toward neglect rather than invasion. No rival is likely to pour vast resources into occupying a remote outpost, while much larger theaters draw attention. But in any calculus of survival, fragility always carries some weight, however distant. Its domestic scale-to-resource ratio remains one of its most valuable features. 5 million people is a population that can be fed, housed, and powered entirely through domestic infrastructure. Many advanced economies surpass that equilibrium, too large to feed themselves without imports, too dependent on foreign fuels to keep grids running independently. This is where resilience in New Zealand appears most durable. Even if the flow of medicines, parts, and technology stopped, its people would not immediately face famine or frozen homes. Sustenance would continue, which is the dividing line between persistence and collapse. The political dimension remains the main variable. If New Zealand's alignment with the US remains largely political and does not involve forward basing, it is likely to remain off strategic maps during escalation. If, however, war expands and Washington demands closer logistical cooperation, adversaries could reassess. The balance is precarious and rests as much on interpretation from rivals as on Wellington's own choices. That lack of certainty is what makes its status a double edge. Insulation on one side, association with rival blocs on the other. Healthcare and basic infrastructure form another pillar. New Zealand provides universal health coverage, and its water and power systems reinforce resilience. Hospitals support themselves with electricity from renewables rather than imported fuel. This is particularly significant when compared with nations that suffer routine grid reliability issues. Medical survival, underlined by earlier discussion of infrastructure dependencies, depends heavily on power and sanitation. New Zealand does not erase vulnerabilities. It still requires imports for advanced medical supplies, but its baseline keeps systems functional in a crisis far longer than global averages. Altogether, New Zealand combines core survival factors that most developed countries lack. Food surpluses and renewable power act as strong internal buffers, directly aligning with the resilience measures identified in GAR 2025. Its population is modest and can be supported without extensive imports. Its strategic distance places it low on adversary targeting lists. The risks remain political rather than geographic. Alliance ties could bring diplomatic pressure that nudges the country into relevance. But absent those triggers, New Zealand's biggest dangers are economic disruption, not bombardment or invasion. This balance defines its double edge. On one hand, it is one of the safest and most sustainable locations in the Pacific, capable of feeding and powering itself in isolation. On the other, its connection to the wider web of alliances keeps open questions about how adversaries may view it during escalating conflict. Geography and resources build natural armor, but politics can erode invisibility. For those seeking practical security, that mixture makes New Zealand exceptional, but not untouchable. The pattern it illustrates is useful when shifting attention outward. Some regions offer similar insulation through distance and natural abundance, though they are less discussed in public debates over survival. Others maintain scale and resources, but lack geostrategic attention entirely. This draws us toward another area often overlooked when the subject of global war arises: territories physically vast, resource-rich, and politically peripheral, yet rarely included when people sketch out World War III's possible theaters. Case study: South America's untouched frontier. South America is often absent from conversations about global war. When military analysts trace their maps of likely flashpoints, they circle the Taiwan Strait, Eastern Europe, and the Gulf. In contrast, the southern half of the Americas sits on the periphery, rarely mentioned and seldom prioritized. That near silence may be its greatest strength. In 2025, there is little strategic incentive for Russia, China, or even Western powers to launch a direct military campaign there. Its vast distance from major battlegrounds, combined with limited strategic weight in global alliances, makes it less likely to feature on anyone's primary target list. For those measuring survival by invisibility, South America begins the contest with a natural head start. What makes the continent particularly interesting is that invisibility combines with resources few other regions can match. It holds expansive farmland, diverse climates, and substantial renewable potential. Yet no single country offers identical prospects. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and the southern frontier of Patagonia each provide distinctive advantages, but also carry vulnerabilities. Choosing between them is less about headlines and more about practicality in wartime: who can feed themselves, keep the lights on, and remain low on priority lists. Brazil represents the largest case. With a defense budget of over $26 billion in 2025, its forces are built for regional stability, not far-flung projection. That scope helps in understanding risk, strong enough to guard its borders, too far removed to warrant global strategic targeting. What sets Brazil apart most is food. It is one of the world's dominant agricultural exporters, leading in soybeans, corn, beef, and coffee. If global supply chains were cut tomorrow, Brazil would not go hungry. The surplus that normally feeds global markets could sustain its 200 million residents with ample reserves. The complication lies not in food, but in politics. Brazil's position in BRICS Plus links it closely with China and Russia, which may reduce the risk of being targeted by them, but raises the prospect of secondary involvement if rival powers attempt to counter BRICS influence. For civilians, the equation is clear. Food is secure, but neutrality may be harder to maintain. Argentina looks different on paper. Its defense spending is far smaller, under $1 billion, leaving it with limited capability to exert pressure abroad. Yet what it lacks in defense weight, it makes up for in farmland. The Pampas grasslands underpin massive production of wheat, corn, and beef, placing Argentina among the top exporters worldwide. In times of global scarcity, that land guarantees basic sustenance for its domestic population. The country's long habit of economic volatility, however, complicates the picture. Persistent inflation and historic financial crises speak to a system that struggles with stability. In wartime, such weakness may leave responses fragmented, even if actual calories are abundant. From a survival standpoint, Argentina offers remarkable food self-reliance, but faces governance hurdles that could magnify stress in an extended crisis. Chile presents a blend of opportunity and fragility. On one hand, it maintains a reputation for strong governance compared to regional peers. Its crime rates are notably lower, with around 37.55 incidents per 1,000 people, about 10% lower than the United States, and its murder rate of 1.7 per 100,000 sits below many developed countries. This stability is significant in a world where internal insecurity rises during resource scarcity. Agricultural exports are meaningful too, with Chile supplying fruit, seafood, and wine globally. Yet the critical weakness lies in energy. In 2023, Chile imported 62.3% of its total energy supply. That dependency ties its daily life to international supply lines. If war disrupts shipping lanes, Chile may have fertile valleys of produce, but an electricity grid that strains to stay lit. This makes it one of the continent's stronger governance models, but also one of its most vulnerable to global shortages in fossil fuels. Uruguay is far smaller, but arguably among the most balanced. Its defense budget is modest compared to its neighbors, yet it enjoys a reputation for political stability and democratic consistency. Healthcare and literacy indicators are high relative to the region, and crime levels remain among the lowest in Latin America. Uruguay's manageable population, fewer than 4 million people, gives it an edge in scaling services during crisis. Reported residency programs have also made it attractive to outsiders seeking a long-term foothold, though such details should always be verified with official government sources rather than secondary reports. The drawback mirrors Chile's. Energy imports represent a vulnerability, but Uruguay compensates by combining renewable investment with small population scale, meaning fewer people compete for resources when systems come under siege. Crime illustrates another dividing line. Brazil's resource strength cannot erase its reputation for insecure urban spaces, gang violence, and uneven policing. In contrast, Uruguay and Chile show measurably lower violence per capita. This matters greatly in war. Even if missiles never fall, civilian insecurity can erode survival prospects. Stability on the ground becomes as necessary as access to food. In that sense, picking a location in South America may be as much about choosing systems of governance as about choosing fertile soil. The southern frontier, Patagonia, deserves separate mention. Stretching across southern Argentina and Chile, it is one of the world's most remote inhabited regions. Spare population density, vast open spaces, clean rivers, and fertile valleys provide natural buffers. Yet Patagonia has little industrial relevance, no dense military infrastructure, and minimal geopolitical importance. In practical terms, that ensures it appears nowhere near the top of adversary strike lists. Its obstacles are climate and remoteness. Winters are harsh, logistics are tough, and communities survive by adaptation more than abundance. But for survival in a global war, Patagonia's irrelevance is its strength. No one is likely to expend resources targeting a cold, sparsely populated hinterland when decisive assets lie an ocean away. When comparing the region as a whole, a pattern emerges. Brazil and Argentina guarantee agricultural surpluses that few countries on Earth can rival. A person living there is unlikely to starve, even in prolonged isolation. Chile and Uruguay stand out for stability, safer streets, and more resilient governance structures, though each must overcome serious energy import dependence. Patagonia represents a unique crossroad of isolation and resource sufficiency, functioning as a fallback zone precisely because it is so far from major centers and holds little strategic appeal. This balanced picture sets South America apart from the pressure zones across Eurasia. Its risks are internal: political turbulence, economic fragility, or energy shortages, not missile barrages or nuclear strikes. For people assessing safety, those risks are tolerable compared to the certainty of devastation elsewhere. The survival message from South America is straightforward. The strongest candidates combine food surplus with stable governance. Argentina and Brazil guarantee food independence. Uruguay and Chile offer safer, more stable societies. Patagonia provides remoteness as a shield. For survival, those are the pillars that matter more than military might. And yet the global picture is not complete. South America may stand apart, but other continents on the fringe of global power also carry survival potential. Distance is one factor, but internal vulnerabilities reshape the balance. Looking outward, another region often overlooked in war games shows the same paradox. Far from strategic targets, yet undermined by fragile systems that make survival more complicated than the map alone suggests. Africa's distance advantage, but at what cost? Africa sits at a geographical distance from the world's most volatile frontiers, making it seem less exposed when people map out global conflict. Naval posturing is concentrated in the Pacific and Eastern Mediterranean, not the Cape of Good Hope. Armored divisions are dug into Eastern Europe and along the Korean Peninsula, not across the Sahara. That relative distance offers an obvious advantage, yet distance is not security on its own. Africa's internal challenges, ranging from unreliable infrastructure to persistent regional conflicts, introduce vulnerabilities that geography cannot erase. Any evaluation of the continent's role in global survival must weigh remoteness, against the fragility of systems within. South Africa captures this tension clearly. By numbers, the country appears strong. It exports cereals, fruits, and nearly 4 million tons of fish in 2019, which on paper signals resilience in food supply. But behind this productive capacity lies an energy system long in disrepair. Since 2007, the national utility Eskom has struggled to provide stable electricity. By 2023, rolling blackouts sometimes lasted as long as 12 hours in a single day. That fragility carries lethal implications in wartime. Hospitals cannot run refrigeration for medicines or power-intensive care machines. Communications networks flicker off. Transportation grinds to a halt as pumping stations and railways stall. In peace, importing fuel for backup generators offers a stopgap. In conflict, when fuel shipments themselves become scarce or disrupted, rolling outages slip into systemic collapse. Security on the ground only deepens the problem. South Africa holds one of the highest murder rates globally, about 34 per 100,000 people, along with widespread violent crime. It consistently ranks near the top of global risk tables for personal safety. In wartime, instability amplifies existing cracks. Shortages drive competition and theft, while inequality worsens desperation. For families attempting to survive disruption, the daily threat of assault or armed robbery becomes as pressing as the absence of imports. Personal security, already fragile, starts from a low baseline that makes resilience harder to sustain. Inequality compounds these risks. South Africa has one of the world's starkest Gini coefficients, a measurement of income distribution. In peacetime, that means wealth sharply divides neighborhoods and living standards. In wartime, it means scarce resources flow disproportionately to those who can afford private security or hoarded supplies, leaving the majority to face shortages unaided. Such divisions rapidly escalate into unrest, with riots and protests damaging infrastructure at the very moment the state is too stretched to protect it. Distance from conflict zones loses significance when internal disorder replicates the same dangers. Geopolitics complicates the outlook further. South Africa's membership in BRICS links it openly to China and Russia. On one hand, this alignment lowers the likelihood of external strikes from those countries. On the other, it places South Africa in awkward proximity if Western alliances seek ways to pressure or weaken the bloc. A global conflict could make Cape Town's ports or Durban's trade crucial, not for direct battles, but as choke points where shipping must pass once Suez falters. The Cape of Good Hope has always carried strategic weight. Recent disruptions in the Red Sea show how quickly traffic can reroute. South Africa's importance as a maritime corridor means avoidance may be impossible, even though it lies thousands of miles away from firing lines. Alignments and trade lanes guarantee attention, even without a single battalion crossing its borders. Energy dependence widens the vulnerability further. Unlike Iceland, with its nearly total reliance on domestic hydro and geothermal power, or Paraguay, with its enormous hydropower surplus, South Africa continues to import significant amounts of fossil fuels. If imports halt, generating capacity falls short of demand almost immediately. Power failures ripple into agriculture, healthcare, and communications. Electricity is the backbone of resilience, and South Africa lacks the autonomy to secure it without external flows. Neutrality cannot repair a grid when shipping routes close. Its defense spending highlights another paradox. At around $2.26 billion in 2025, South Africa's budget is small compared to militarized border states near Eurasia's hotspots. That modest profile means it presents little threat abroad, lowering incentives for preemptive strikes. But the same restraint means limited capacity to defend infrastructure, quell unrest, or control borders under pressure. Weak deterrence translates to fragility if instability grows internally. Safety in Africa, as in many regions, depends less on avoiding missiles and more on whether domestic order can hold. While South Africa dominates focus due to its size and visibility, contrast matters. Small island states such as Mauritius and Seychelles embody a different survival equation. They host no major bases, pose no threat to great powers, and produce little that would warrant intervention. Their governance structures are relatively stable, and crime rates remain far lower than South Africa's. In strategic terms, they are invisible. For survival, insignificance may outweigh abundance. They import heavily during peacetime, but as war reshapes trade, these nations avoid standing on anyone's target list. Quiet obscurity becomes their shield, while South Africa is pulled toward risk by scale and linkage to global systems. More broadly, Africa's distance advantage comes with sharp caveats. The continent is not uniform in risk. While it sits apart from great power rivalries, many regions already endure high levels of instability without a single foreign bomb dropped. The Sahel continues to see insurgencies displace populations. Sudan's conflicts produce humanitarian crises lethal even in peacetime. Nigeria battles both economic fragility and internal violence, undermining cohesion independently of world wars. These examples demonstrate that survival depends on local conditions, not just continental geography. Africa's remoteness from global rivalries limits exposure to naval battles or tank offensives, but its internal conflicts, fragile infrastructure, and energy shortages ensure that daily life in many places remains fraught even without outside attack. The balance is precise. Distance helps, but it does not erase weakness. Southern Africa may avoid missile salvos, yet a crumbling grid or spikes in violent crime pose threats just as destabilizing. Peripheral nations like Mauritius illustrate how stability and insignificance combine into real safety, while larger economies like South Africa show how internal fragility can cancel the advantage of isolation. Survival planning based on Africa must recognize this split. Security is conditional, dependent on whether governance keeps lights on, streets calm, and resources equitably shared once imports halt. Taken in this frame, Africa teaches the most sobering lesson of all. Distance is useful, but it is not decisive. No matter how resilient farmland or fisheries may be, survival rests on whether systems remain intact when pressures mount. And those evaluating options cannot stop at the map itself. The reality is that endurance depends on more than distance, food, or energy. Even if a place offers all three, survival still comes down to whether you can belong there at all. The real practicalities: cost, visas, and acceptance. A country can be distant from conflict zones, rich in resources, and politically stable, but none of those qualities matter if you cannot legally stay there. Practical survival is not only about geography, it hinges on access. Visas, residency permits, and the reality of cultural acceptance often define who actually benefits from a so-called safe haven. These are the real obstacles between theory on a map and the experience of living in a secure country during crisis. Border controls and legal systems are the gatekeepers. Even in times of peace, they regulate who enters and who remains. In a global conflict, those gates will narrow. Governments prioritize citizens first, reserving food, fuel, and shelter internally. For outsiders, a lack of legal residence could mean being barred outright, left outside looking in regardless of a nation's apparent resilience. Which means the starting point is not just identifying where survival looks promising, but who is prepared to let you in before disruption begins. Some nations keep their doors more open than others. Uruguay is widely regarded as one of the most straightforward residency options in 2025. According to regional assessments, it provides relatively accessible legal pathways compared to the high costs or strict barriers found elsewhere. Securing residency there allows access to public services, including healthcare and education, under the umbrella of a stable democracy. This blend of openness and political consistency makes it a realistic choice for those planning ahead. Unlike locations that demand extraordinary wealth, Uruguay's approach allows entry without requiring millions in investment. New Zealand offers another possibility, though the process is more restrictive and costly. Residency typically comes through skilled worker permits, investment categories, or family sponsorships, each requiring substantial evidence of value placed on applicants. While these pathways remain open, they heavily favor those with either financial independence or specific skills the nation seeks. For successful applicants, however, the rewards are real: legal access to a country with agricultural surpluses, renewable energy resilience, and a functioning healthcare system. Yet for ordinary middle-income individuals, the hurdles can be steep. Living costs in New Zealand are among the highest in the region, with property in particular remaining expensive. Entry exists, but it requires either substantial preparation or the right set of credentials. Other nations are far less accessible. Japan, despite its stability and advanced infrastructure, restricts long-term immigration tightly. Without professional employment arrangements or strong family ties, residency is often closed off, and permanent status is extremely difficult to secure quickly. For anyone without prior integration, waiting until global conflict to attempt entry would be pointless. Strict border and residency practices turn theoretical safety into irrelevance. What seems like a refuge on the map cannot be reached without years of earlier preparation. Some countries present safety as a product available for purchase. A number of states operate citizenship by investment or residency through financial contribution, granting rights to live and work in exchange for capital placed into government bonds or assets. Caribbean microstates are often cited as examples, where applicants can buy legal access with significant sums. While these programs provide rapid entry in peacetime and guarantee residency in crisis, the catch is cost. For most people, investing such amounts is unfeasible, making this pathway a narrow option for wealth alone. Any plan based on it requires not just capital, but confidence that programs remain open under wartime disruption. Beyond paperwork, cultural acceptance shapes survival. Entry is not the same as integration. A residency permit grants the law, but community attitudes decide everyday life. Uruguay's long track record of incorporating immigrants from Europe, Asia, and neighboring Latin America means a more diverse population and lower levels of resistance toward newcomers. This social openness improves the practical reality of survival. Foreigners can find space within local economies and neighborhoods with less hostility. By contrast, New Zealand highlights the complexity of cultural acceptance. Its immigrant population is already sizable, and the government supports integration programs, but debates over limited housing and competition for resources often stir resentment. In a time of scarcity, those pressures could intensify. Foreign residents without established ties may face skepticism in daily life, even if they hold legal visas. Social integration runs alongside legal approval. Without both, survival can mean living isolated and outside of full community access. Timing is just as crucial as access. Research consistently stresses that waiting until crisis strikes is not realistic. Once conflicts escalate, airports may close, airlines ground flights, and visa issuance grind to a halt. Port authorities direct shipping lanes to military supply, not civilian passengers. At that point, moving into a supposedly safe nation without prior residency is effectively impossible. Securing legal status early is non-negotiable. The only candidates with realistic access when war breaks out will be those already embedded legally. You must secure residency before the storm. Waiting until conflict begins is a plan to fail. Economic planning joins the legal and social sides of relocation. A newcomer may hold the right visa but find living costs prohibitive. Uruguay is comparatively affordable by global standards, allowing wages and savings to stretch further. By contrast, New Zealand, though strong in resilience, often strains household budgets because of high property costs and elevated prices for imported goods. Moving there means factoring not only the legal hurdles, but also the ability to fund daily life. During instability, inflation magnifies these costs, eroding even carefully prepared budgets. Access is not enough. Sustainability is essential. The practicalities, then, reduce survival planning into three linked requirements: legal status, financial planning, and social integration. Each carries equal weight. Paperwork grants entry, finance sustains everyday needs, and cultural acceptance defines whether a person can participate fully in community life. Leave out one, and survival fragments quickly. Relocation underlines this reality sharply. Talking of safety in terms of geography or resources overlooks the basic mechanisms of belonging. Only by holding the right to enter, budget to survive, and a place among residents does a safe country truly become an option? Uruguay shows one affordable and accessible route. New Zealand illustrates a harder but viable path with higher costs. Nations with severe restrictions or pay-to-enter systems are closed or realistic only for small numbers of privileged applicants. Each case answers the same question differently, not just which place is the safest, but who is actually allowed to live there. For those preparing, the lesson is sharp. Resilience cannot be abstract, it must be lived, and living depends on institutions, communities, and laws. Identifying countries with strong food, energy, and healthcare resilience is step one. Embedding yourself legally in one of those societies is the final barrier. If this last stage fails, all the prior analysis is meaningless. Practical considerations strip survival back to fundamentals. The resources of a country are vital, but they are inaccessible without permission. The affordability of a household budget matters, but it is irrelevant without basic visas. And a community's acceptance of foreigners makes the difference between living inside a supportive network or isolated on the margins. Together, these layers form the line between theoretical safety and practice. Preparing them is not paranoia, it is preparation rooted in reality. From this perspective, the conversation about survival shifts again. It is not only about the land, the grid, or the hospitals. It is about the systems that decide who may benefit from those assets. And these often silent rules quietly shape which nations provide real lifelines when conflict spreads. Safety is not measured by how far you are from the front lines. It depends on whether a society can consistently feed its people, power its homes, and keep its hospitals functioning under isolation. The Global Assessment Report 2025 makes this clear. Resilience comes from stronger systems, not just from distance or neutrality. The harder reality is that survival choices are made in advance, where you decide to live, and the strength of the systems you rely on will shape your future, which raises the question, where would you consider moving? An island, South America, or somewhere else?